In the early to mid-18th century, waves of Scots-Irish and German immigrants settled in the majestic Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. These settlers, bold and self-reliant, quickly realized that they would need to fend for themselves in their relatively isolated homesteads. The Great War Road, which connected the Six Nations in the north to the Cherokee in the south, passed through this rugged land, an ideal environment to forge the spirit of a frontiersman. Among the families that ventured into this wilderness were the Sullivans, who settled along the south branch of the Potomac River. There were 3 Sullivan children, James, Sarah, and Daniel. In 1763, as Pontiac's War raged in the west, and native raiders targeted forts and settlements along the Ohio Valley, 9-year-old Daniel Sullivan and a boy named Cunningham were captured by a Lenape war party. During their journey back to Indian Territory, the warriors decided to test the boys by making them run the gauntlet, a brutal initiation where young warriors stood in 2 columns, armed with clubs, eager to strike. Cunningham ran first, enduring his blows and reaching the end. When it was Daniel's turn, he did something unexpected. After being hit with a club, he turned around and knocked a warrior to the ground, then jumped on top of him, punching him repeatedly. The Lenape war chiefs were amused by his fighting spirit, and as a result, both boys were adopted into the tribe. Back in the Lenape towns, Daniel and Cunningham underwent adoption rituals. Their hair was shaved, leaving a topknot, and their European clothes were removed, and their skin was scrubbed to cleanse them of their whiteness. Piercings were made through their noses and ears, adorned with silver jewelry. They were no longer Virginians, they were Lenape Delaware. Life among the Lenape was a dream for the boys. No more early mornings doing farm chores or attending church and school. Instead, they roamed the forests, honing their hunting skills. For the next 9 years, this was the world. Meanwhile, back home, Daniel's siblings moved on with their lives. James settled near Fort Pitt, which is modern-day Pittsburgh, while Sarah married Zadok Wright and settled south of the fort. In 1772, a Lenape trading expedition to Fort Pitt included both Sullivan and Cunningham. By chance, they were recognized by Zadok Wright, even though the boys were dressed in native attire and had been missing for nearly a decade. Wright negotiated Cunningham's release easily, but it wasn't so simple with Sullivan. He had been fully embraced by his native brothers and was in no hurry to return to the white man's world. The negotiations dragged on, becoming increasingly expensive. A horse, pack saddle, 6 hatchets, 3 red blankets, and a gallon of whiskey were offered in exchange for Daniel. Though the Lenape chief accepted the offer, Sullivan shook his head, rejecting it. He told Zadok that only a genuine beaver hat would persuade him. Zadok, trying to cut costs, bought a cheap wool imitation, but Sullivan, knowing the difference, held firm. Finally, a beaver hat was purchased, and though Sullivan loved the hat, he was still reluctant to leave his native family. But a deal was a deal, and he returned. Cunningham rejoined colonial life easily, but for Daniel it was a different story. He had almost entirely forgotten how to live as a white person. He refused to do farm work, calling anyone who did a squaw, since in many eastern woodland tribes that was considered women's labor. His place, as he saw it, was in the forest, hunting, fishing, and living freely. Within a year, Sullivan had enough of this civilized life. One morning he arrived at church, dressed in full Lenape attire with breech-clout, leggings, and painted skin. He startled the congregation with a loud war whoop, then disappeared back into the wilderness. Sullivan returned to Fort Pitt and made a living as a hunter. Soon after, conflict erupted in Lord Dunbar's War, and Sullivan enlisted in Major John Connolly's Virginia militia, serving alongside famous frontiersmen like Simon Girty and Simon Kenton, Daniel Boone's close friend. Sullivan worked as a scout and guide, a role he continued into the American Revolution, serving Virginia. In 1776, while patrolling the Kanawha River, Sullivan had a close call. He and another scout encountered a small party of natives. Gunfire was exchanged and Sullivan was hit in the arm. One native was mortally wounded. 3 months later, Sullivan was sent into Ohio to spy on British allied natives and gather intelligence. He spent time among the Lenape who desired neutrality, but were caught between British and Patriot forces. Sullivan eventually made his way to Detroit, the British Western headquarters, and stayed with Indian interpreter William Tucker, whose wife knew Sullivan's sister Sarah. Sullivan learned that Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, known as the hair buyer for paying high prices for American scalps, encouraged native raids on frontier settlements. While in Detroit, Sullivan was recognized by Pluggy's son, a native man who had been part of the skirmish a year earlier where Sullivan had killed his brother-in-law. Sullivan was captured, verified by a scar, and sent to Quebec as a prisoner. He was paroled in New York in December 1777, and didn't return to Fort Pitt until March 1778. Upon his return, tensions with the natives were high. Indian agent George Morgan tasked Sullivan with persuading the Lenape to reject an unfair treaty made by the militia, which allowed American troops to use Lenape lands. Sullivan, respected by the Lenape, succeeded. However, the militia, angered by his actions, briefly imprisoned him. After his release, Sullivan and his brother James moved west. As the war wound down, they ventured into land speculation, setting up near the Falls of Ohio, now Louisville, Kentucky. By 1782, Daniel had married Susan de la Fere, and they had a son, Daniel Jr. Later that year, the brothers worked for George Rogers Clark, building gunboats to patrol the Ohio River. Sullivan also took on the dangerous job of express courier, delivering messages along the river. On September 11, 1782, while passing Fort Henry, which is modern-day Wheeling, West Virginia, Sullivan's boat was attacked by British Rangers and their native allies. He was struck in the heel but managed to reach the fort, where Betty Zane nursed him back to health. The same Betty Zane who made the daring dash out the fort's gate to her brother's cabin to retrieve its stash of gunpowder. She ran back to the fort to a hail of gunfire and replenished the fort's supply. This act of heroism made her a legend in her own time. A couple months later, Sullivan was back in the saddle, delivering messages. After the war, Sullivan moved further west, settling near Vincennes in present-day Indiana. He set up a mill north of town. The lands north of Vincennes would be called Sullivan County in the decades to come. There are quite a few towns and counties named Sullivan in the Midwest and eastern United States. Most of them are named after General John Sullivan, a prominent general during the Revolution. The county in Indiana is the only one named after Daniel Sullivan. To the French citizens of Vincennes, Sullivan was known to be a bit of a ruffian. He dragged a Piankishaw man through the streets in retaliation for Indian attacks, and in April 1786, he led a militia force into present-day Illinois and attacked Wabash Indians camped along the Umbra River. The attack didn't go too well, and only emboldened the Indians who moved further north to gather more reinforcements. If you'd like to hear more about Vincennes during this time, you can watch my previous video on the topic. In 1790, Daniel Sullivan would make his last delivery. While traveling on the Buffalo Trace, he and 17 men were attacked by a party of natives. They called out to Sullivan by name and demanded his surrender, but he refused and vowed to fight to the death. A fight ensued, and most of the men in Sullivan's company were slaughtered. One of the men laid among the bodies playing dead and witnessed Daniel Sullivan's last stand. Legend has it that after Sullivan's rifle broke apart, he kept clubbing away. Even when his entrails were hanging from his abdomen, he kept fighting. In a final act of defiance, he cut his entrails and continued fighting back. The natives were amazed by this man's fighting spirit. And finally, Daniel Sullivan was shot dead. While many of the other bodies were mutilated, they treated Sullivan's body with respect. They honored him by cutting out his heart, chopping it up, and putting pieces of it into soup, which was shared among the warriors. They hoped that by eating his heart, they could gain his courage. Sullivan's body did not remain heartless, however. The warriors replaced his heart with one carved from wood. This wooden heart would become a family heirloom and kept in the family for over 100 years. The last known location of the heart was Florissant, Missouri in 1920. It seems to be lost forever, as no one knows what happened to Daniel Sullivan's wooden heart. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and take care.